Think TikTok is great for artists. You're able to get your work out there, people are able to comment, and it's just, convenient. It's at your fingertips. But I also think it comes with issues, especially when it comes to beginner artists and, methods. Because within the TikTok community, because it is so accessible, it is also accessible to hate and, gatekeeping. And a lot of people love to gatekeep art, which is crazy to me. So today I wanted to talk about it. So first off, what is gatekeeping? Gatekeeping is basically when people decide who's allowed to be part of a community, like what is allowed in the community. On TikTok, it can look like dismissing beginner work as cringe, claiming digital artists have it easy, saying fan art or stylized work isn't like real art, mocking people who use references or templates, mocking people who use a certain method and saying that it's not real art because of the way that they've drawn it, etc., etc. Gatekeeping is not saying that AI art is bad, because it is. Generative AI is bad, and that is not what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about today is why gatekeeping is a problem within the community. It hurts innovation, and it punishes people for experimenting, and worst of all, it reinforces outdated, exclusionary standards of what art should be. Creators, especially young or marginalized ones, are constantly told their work doesn't count, and it discourages them from growing and learning and becoming better artists. And the twist is, most great artists started by copying, tracing, and mimicking styles. Many professionals still use references, digital tools, and time-saving methods. But on TikTok, if you admit to tracing or, using digital brushes, you're pretty much shamed, even though these tools are part of modern creative workflows. I think one of the worst parts about this is knowing that a lot of the people who gatekeep art aren't actually artists, and they don't actually create art for themselves. They just like to view other art, which, is why they have the power to democratize art. How are we going to push back from this? So I think that in general, we should celebrate all forms of art: polished, messy, digital, traditional. Call out people who use this elitist viewpoint. You should encourage learning over perfection, because not everyone's perfect, especially when you're a beginner. Art is supposed to be beginner friendly. It should be accessible to everybody, and when people gatekeep it, it becomes less and less accessible, and it becomes more of a privilege than a hobby. I think it's so important to remember that, everyone starts somewhere. So, the next time someone tells you what real art is, you just need to remember that real artists lift each other up. Gatekeepers are just afraid of open doors, and that's it. It does suck because usually the loudest voices are the most negative ones, and it can be really harmful to beginner artists, Imagine getting a comment when your art isn't, perfect or polished, or, you're still unconfident with your art and art style and you're still learning. Imagine getting a comment saying that it's not real art. That would be so horrible and dehumanizing. I would hate that. And I think that's why it's so important to, uplift other artists and stop this, gatekeeping nature and community, because it's not cool. I think TikTok is probably the biggest platform that romanticizes raw talent. Artists who can magically draw perfectly from the age of 5. But, it perpetuates the myth that if you're not born with it, you're not a real artist. But art is a skill, not just a talent. It's something that's built over time through practice, failure, and learning. It, gatekeeping discourages people who come to art later in life. Another thing that this gatekeeping causes is classism. Artists who use cheaper tools like dollar stomping, phone apps or things instead of styluses often get mocked. Meanwhile, those with, expensive iPads, Procreative packs and Copic markers are perceived as more professional. And yeah, I can see in some ways that if you're looking for a career, it is important to have the right set of tools. But on TikTok, it creates an unspoken barrier where only the well-resourced are seen as legit artists. And TikTok's algorithm favors certain types of content: fast time lapses, polished aesthetics, and, often white creators. And it creates a lot of visibility bias where detailed or slower art or styles outside of mainstream trends get buried, and some artists feel forced to change their content just to be seen. Another thing is, neurodivergent and disabled artists. They work in non-traditional ways a lot of the time because, they have support tools and it helps them draw with limited mobility. And gatekeepers often label these methods as cheating or lazy, which, further marginalizes people who use art as a therapeutic or accessible outlet. Creativity isn't a one size fits all, and judging it that way is ableist. There's also this double standard around tracing and referencing, which is very seen in the TikTok and sometimes the Twitter community, but I'm not as active in the Twitter community. Where established artists reference models, photos, and even trace sometimes, often without backlash. But when newer creators do the same, they're accused of stealing or not being real artists. Now, I do agree that you shouldn't trait other people's art and claim it as your own. That is wrong. But they can be tools, if used properly, that have genuine value in the learning process of art. And I think it's important that we shouldn't harass people who, credit properly and use it in, a way that boosts their art instead of just making it the whole art. A lot of gatekeepers look down on artists who, go viral, sell merch, and do fan art commissions, claiming they've sold out and just doing it for the money. But art as a career is valid, and commercial art can still be deeply expressive. Success doesn't negate sincerity. And that's just what I wanted to talk about. I think these issues are most prevalent on TikTok, so that's why I mention it so much. It's because TikTok is fast-paced, 15-second videos, you can watch so many a day, and it's so easy to get caught up in the negativity of TikTok, and it's so easy to just, forget that there are actual people on the screens, and that's why people are so hateful as well, because, it's just a 15-second clip, what can one hate comment do? But you need to think about it. If you're one of these people who, gatekeeps or, is pushing this negative rhetoric when it comes to art and making it less accessible for people, just remember these are actual people with actual lives. Art is a hobby for most people, and if it's a career, that's fine, but a lot of people on TikTok, it's a hobby. So please just be kind, treat yourself with kindness, and I'll see you guys next time.